lot of people who held to more of our theological perspective were killed, and their works were burned.
Could you give us a basic breakdown of the essential parts of what is
Sure.
Calvinism itself?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me say this. It's only fair to learn Calvinism from an actual Calvinist. And I'm not one anymore. And so a book like Chosen by God by R.C. Sproul would be a good primer for those that want to study this for themselves.
Hmm.
But Calvinism is oftentimes summarized with the acrostic TULIP, TULIP. And
Right,
so I'll just give you a brief explanation of that. Now, remember, that Calvinism isn't monolithic in the sense that every single Calvinist holds to all five of the points or would define all five of the points in the exact same way. So I'm going to be very broad to
right,
include what I would consider every Calvinist, if that makes sense.
right, right,
And that would really focus on three of the major points because some are called 4-point Calvinists because they drop the L, limited atonement. Some of them have differing views with regard to perseverance and those kinds of things, the P
right,
of the TULIP. And so the three major points that are, I think, in question would be the T, the U, and the I. And so
right.
let me summarize those. The T would say that not only are we totally depraved, which I think we could all get on board with the fact that we're all sinners, we fall short of God's glory, we all need a savior, we're depraved in the sense that depravity infects us, it affects every part of us. We're not as bad as we could be, but we are all sin stained and impacted by sin, and we're born in a fallen world. All of those things we would be on board with a Calvinist on.
Hmm.
But the T of total depravity, as R.C. Sproul would call it, radical inability, moral inability, MacArthur refers to it as. And what they're talking about there is this concept that we're born in such a corrupt condition from birth that we would always say no to the gospel unless we were picked before we were born, unconditional election, and irresistibly grace, the I of TULIP.
Mm.
And so you're in a condition from birth by divine decree, because God decrees whatsoever comes to pass on the Calvinistic worldview. So since the fall of Adam, everyone's born in a condition where they would never desire, because of their corrupt condition from birth, they would never desire to accept the gospel unless God picked them unilaterally before they were born for reasons that aren't revealed to us. We don't know why he picks one person over another. It's
Right,
unconditional. So he
right.
chooses some people for reasons that only he knows, and he irresistibly graces them. Now, this doesn't mean that he's dragging them kicking and screaming to heaven, whether they want to go or not. What it means is he changes the very heart of who they are. He changes their desires, their nature, and makes them want to come to him. And so you're born by God's decree, unable to want to come to him unless he chose you and changes your desires, your wants to make you want him. And everybody he's picked from before the foundation of the world, he's going to change your desires and cause you to want to come to him. And everyone he didn't pick before the foundation of the world is born in a condition where they will always want to reject the gospel. And he lets them go in their natural state, desiring sin and desiring selfishness and desiring to reject the things of God. And so basically, it is the concept and idea that God is predestined before the foundation of the world, whether you will believe or you won't believe, and that everybody's fate is ultimately determined before they're ever born. That's the foundational concepts of what entails Calvinism. And you can understand why that might be controversial, obviously. This concept and idea that God has ultimately determined whether you're going to heaven or hell before you're ever born is kind of the basic underlying point of contention between the Calvinistic worldview and the non-Calvinistic worldview.
Excellent. Good primer there, especially. The opposite extreme of that is Arminianism. So, could you tell us what that is in a nutshell?
Yeah, I don't even know I would necessarily call it the opposite extreme of that because even Arminius, Jacobus Arminius, was raised in Geneva as a student of Calvin's teaching
Okay,
under the
gotcha.
teaching of Beza. So even some of what Arminius taught and believed would have been very much in line with Calvinism, but he is known because he contended with a particular 5 points within the Calvinistic teachings that later, through the Remonstrance and Synod of Dort and all those things, became popularized as those 5 points of Calvinism that we know today, and some of the battling they did between those 5 points and how those nuanced out. And again, just like with Calvinism, Arminianism is not monolithic. Many
Right.
people might even try to put me in the Arminian camp
Yeah.
because I'm not a Calvinist, and they just assume that this is binary. You're either a Calvinist or an Arminian. And many of us Southern Baptists don't like to be called Arminians because sometimes the concept of Arminianism is linked with maybe this concept and idea that you can accidentally fall out of faith or fall out of salvation because you sin too many times, which again is not something Arminius taught, but sometimes that's
Right.
associated with Arminianism.
Right.
And there are differing views of the anthropology, the nature of man from birth, and those kinds of things. And so that's one of the reasons that I have referred to myself as more of a traditional Southern Baptist, because over the last 100 years or so, I teach very much like what Herschel Hobbes or Adrian Rogers or the traditional Southern Baptist. When Southern Baptist became the biggest denomination in the world, it was under more of a traditional
Mhm.
whosoever will, if you want to call it that, a whosoever will kind of theology, which I have termed the concept of being called provisionism, that God
Right.
provides for every man, woman, boy, and girl. And so that's kind of an umbrella term that basically says, because we believe God provides for everyone, no one perishes for a lack of atonement. No one perishes because God didn't choose them. No
Right.
one perishes because they were just born that way and couldn't help it, which is what the T and the I ultimately suggests.
Hmm.
And so no, we're saying, no, God has provided for everyone. And because of the way he created us, it's not something we built for ourselves, like we're out there in the tool shed building ourselves a will. No, God gave us this ability to know right from wrong. Ever since the fall, he says they will know the difference between right and wrong. We have a conscience. That conscience can become seared, but until that point, it has the ability to judge right from wrong, good from evil. And we have the ability to respond to the proffered grace of God by either accepting or rejecting the offer of the gospel, the appeal of the gospel, which we believe is made universally to all people. And thus, everyone can accept or reject it. God has not decided beforehand who will and won't accept or reject it. And so, he ultimately, in our view, he's given us that responsibility for ourselves. And so, if you reject the gospel, it's not because God first rejected you. And if you accept the gospel, it's not because God irresistibly graced you and withheld that grace that was sufficient from everyone else or from those who are reprobates or non-elect or something like that. So that's where we would contend with each other. And so, yes, I would side more on the theological scale towards the Arminian side, obviously, because I reject a lot of the same things that the Arminian would reject. But even those labels can sometimes be misleading because everyone defines those a little differently based upon their own upbringing, maybe their own training, or who they're influenced by.
Right. Exactly. Because when you shake it out, I mean, there are quite a few shades of variation between, what one believes in those areas. But yeah, you get it's the broad brush type of thing. What do you think are and let me add this. So talking about provisionism, I don't if you want to elaborate a little more on provisionism and define it a little more clearly, that's fine. You've already told us what it is, but it'd be welcome if you want to. Because on the other end of this too if I understand, as I followed this along in the last, especially in the last 3 years or so, and following your podcast, especially that provisionists are often labeled Pelagian. Can is would that be correct assessment that a lot of times that's what the accusation is, not just
Well,
Arminian but Pelagianism?
we are, yes, often called Pelagians, but
Okay.
Pelagian is one of those pejorative terms, kind of a boogeyman labels that has been
Yes.
slapped on anyone who is to the left of you, so to
Right.
speak. Even matter of fact, what I found hilarious was when Adam Harwood was on talking about his systematic, which, by the way, tell your audience about Adam Harwood's systematic if you haven't already, because it's really, really good.
Yeah, we're
Um,
using it. Thanks to your suggestion, we're going to use it to develop some of our theology courses at Louisiana Baptist. So thank you.
it's a great work, and I'm really proud of Adam's work on that, and he's done a really good job.
Yes.
But he pointed out to me in a broadcast that Luther actually called Ulrich Zwingli a Pelagian, which I just found hilarious because Ulrich Zwingli is obviously a pretty hardcore 5-point Calvinist, but because he differed on inherited guilt and the concept of imputed guilt with imputed righteousness and that kind of correlation, much like Millard Erickson, who was another Calvinistic theologian who held to similar views, we're being referred to as Pelagians. Why? Because if they're the left of me or to the right of me, whatever you want to call left or right, I'm not sure where the spectrum is on the left or right, but
Right.
anybody that's not where I am, anybody who's to that side of me is going to be given this boogeyman label of, oh, it's dangerous. Oh, it's just so terrible that they're over there on that side. And when you go back, as several scholars have, and you look at the actual debate between Pelagius and Augustine, you will learn very quickly that Augustine mischaracterized a lot of what Pelagius said, and he even
Yes.
admitted
Yeah.
that he mischaracterized a lot of what Pelagius actually believed and taught. And that many scholars, even from the Calvinistic worldview, have admitted that Augustine took quite a divergence from the teachings of the early church. In other words, Pelagius was more in line with the teachings of the early church than Augustine was on many of these matters. I'm not
Hmm.
trying to say that Pelagius was right about everything he taught. I'm sure I would disagree with many of things that Pelagius concluded, just as many Calvinists would disagree with many things that Augustine concluded as well. So these are obviously fallible men who had a difference of opinion on some theological issues, but a lot of that has shaken out over the course of human history with various different camps siding on one thing or another, and then there's labels that come up. The first time we have a record of this term semi-Pelagianism is not until I think the 1500s, and I think it's by Beza,
Mm.
a student of Calvin. That's the first one to start using this terminology, and he used that term in reference to Molinists at the time, who have a very high view of God's sovereignty. But again, it's a boogeyman label, and what that is when you find a known heretic, somebody that was outed by the councils that I agree with, then I can get this label and just slap this label on them, and then
Hmm.
they have tinfoil on their heads. They're the heretics, and I don't have to really deal with their arguments or their beliefs because I've cast them out of the camp, so to speak. And unfortunately, and I'm certainly not accusing all Calvinists of this. In fact, I know that many Calvinists would absolutely repudiate the actions of some of their ancestors, but it's just a fact of the matter that Calvinists tended to be kind of the theological bullies of their day. And when non-Calvinists would rise up and begin to speak out, they would often get killed and burned along with all their things. And again, I'm not trying to be mean, and I'm not trying to say Calvinists would do that today. At
Right.
least
Right.
most of them, I
Yeah.
would hope not do that to anybody. But that's just the unfortunate history of our past. Is that the free will guys tended to be a little bit softer spoken, tended to be a little kinder. Balthasar Hubmaier, for example, who believed in believers' baptism and free will, and said, "Hey, we shouldn't try to win people with sword and fire, but with patience and prayer, because we want to give them as much time as we can to convince their wills to change." He would argue, and so his free will understanding of God and his free will understanding of theology drove his patience and his love for even an unbeliever, a pagan.
Hmm.
And he said we shouldn't be putting them to death. We shouldn't be trying to kill our dissenters. We should be patient with them and try to win them over with love and prayer. And of course, he believed in believers' baptism. He believed in a lot of the same things that we as Baptists would hold dear in our own theology today. And yet he was killed for his belief in believers' baptism, was burned at the stake by under the rule of Ulrich Zwingli, and his wife had a millstone tied around her neck and was thrown into the river for her beliefs. And so a lot of his writings were just destroyed. And so a lot of people think, well, why can't we find more writings representing our perspective? Well, again, a lot of people who held to more of our theological perspective were killed, and their works were burned. And so that's why you don't see much of us as near as much of us being represented throughout Christian history is for that reason, unfortunately.
Right. Wow. Yeah. He didn't put his documents on the cloud. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, I wish we had the cloud. That
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. And I really appreciate some of your videos. Some of your videos that you did, it's a while back, where you explained a lot about that, about some of the mischaracterization of Pelagian, and very interesting, very intriguing.